Let's do it.
Okay. I feel woefully underprepared.
Good to see nothing's changed. That's great.
A good session. Okay. Just the customary throat clearing, obviously. Got to remember the patter.
Think of the theme music.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to Tokyo Jazz Joints. Like all good bands, it's a comeback. And we're back just for a short time, just for a couple of episodes probably. But James, it's been, from my side, new house, new country, depending on your politics, same banter, unfortunately. And of course, it's a new year because we haven't recorded since the last episode we released was 2021.
I have to check. We can edit that in. I can't remember. It's been so long.
Much has happened.
Yeah. New
How are
house,
things with you?
New country. Geez, I wish I had such exciting news, man. But, new member of the OK Jazz Home here, my little dog, Sam, who will most likely be making a guest appearance at some point during this recording. So keep your ears attuned to that. But I am so happy to be back, man. We've got jazz to talk about. Why have we waited so long? I put the blame solely on you.
Yeah, I'd say it is largely my fault. There was also the small matter of the pandemic, which for our more avid listeners who are vaguely interested in my travel plans, I left Japan 2017. I went back within about a year in 2018. And obviously that was the trip that we documented around Kyushu and up in Hokkaido. And unfortunately, because of the combination of COVID and what can only be described as very draconian immigration laws in Japan around COVID, I'm still unable to get back. So it's actually going to be, and it pains me to say this, it's going to be 4 years by the time I get back, assuming that I'm able to get back in this autumn. So I don't know if I can maybe shoulder like 100% of the blame, James.
Okay. I'll give you a slight pass on that. Having my own experiences with the Japanese immigration system, but we won't go into that. Let's keep it swinging. Yes, it has been. Can you believe it? 4 years. But I just to let everybody feel reassured, I have been hitting the jazz spots over the last couple months since things did sort of calm down a bit here with the pandemic and opening hours were extended again. And that's why we brought the band back together today, right? We're going to go through a little bit of my recent travels domestically here in Japan. Still can't travel internationally very safely in and out of the country. A little bit risky, but I can get around Japan. And so, what we've been talking about a little bit over the last few weeks is, I'm going to try to scout out a few places here and there. And then when you do get back, we'll know where we need to go to take the pictures, save some time.
Yep. Well, I'm gonna try and barely contain my jealousy that you're able to go to these places, and I'm only able just to flick sadly through the TokyoJazzJoints.com website. But we're going to call this episode 6 Kyushu Joints, and obviously it's a fairly self-explanatory title because you most recently went on a weekend trip to Kyushu. You took advantage of the very generous offers from the Japan Domestic Tourist Board, I believe. And if I've been listening correctly, and I, in fairness, don't listen to a lot of what you say in much detail, but I believe Miyazaki, Takanabe, and then, of course, our favorite place, Fukuoka. So those were the 3 places that you hit. So if you're not familiar with those places, the first thing you want to do is you want to get onto Google Maps there, get those 3 places up so you can follow along with us. So where did you kick off, James? And was it all new places, or were there any places that we had also been to together?
We started out with 4 brand new joints for me, and then two revisits, 2 places we've been to together. And, for people who've been to Japan, or if you haven't been to Japan, you're looking at the map, Kyushu is the southernmost of the 4 major islands, and Miyazaki is the southeast prefecture. It faces the Pacific Ocean. And this is a good 900 kilometers from Tokyo. So it's pretty far. It's a lot closer to Taiwan than it is to the Tokyo metro area. and it's a pretty, I wouldn't say it's a backwater, but I mean, it's pretty sparsely populated. I suppose the most famous thing Miyazaki Prefecture has going for it are mangoes, and there's a famous golf tournament where you land at the airport and there's just giant banners and posters of like Japanese and international golf athletes who I've never heard of because I don't play the game. But apparently there's some big tournament there. But it seems to be, it's pretty off the beaten path. And it's one reason that when we did our big trip to Kyushu, Philip, several years back, we didn't make it to Miyazaki because at the time we thought, well, it's hard to get to. It's in the middle of nowhere. We don't know about the joints yet. Nobody told us about them. But this time I decided, look, I'd been trapped in the house for so many months. I just wanted to get out. Why not go as far south as I can get? And luckily, and I'd like to give him a quick shout out already, new friend of mine, Ishii-san, who's on Instagram at Randy Rhodes. He's a guy who I've been following for years, and he's followed me. He always posts pictures of jazz kisaten around Kyushu Island. So I texted him and I said, hey, what do you know about Miyazaki? And he hooked me up with the names of a bunch of places, even the names of the owners. So that was, how that is. It's always good to have that intro when you walk in for the first time.
Absolutely, yeah. We've come across that a few times, haven't we? I mean, obviously, if we'd known about the famous mangoes of Miyazaki, I think we might have made it a stop on our trip to Kyushu, but we were trying to pack a lot in. But yeah, it's definitely useful to have an intro. And like we've said this a few times, I think when you do go to these places, and if you are able to get back to Japan, or indeed you're listening from in Japan, we know like a lot of listeners are in Japan. I think like regardless of language ability, how much Japanese you have, I think if you just go in and play the game, like you will always be welcomed. I think probably owners have sometimes had, maybe bad experiences, and not to tar everyone with the same brush, but they, sometimes they've had their sort of peace and quiet shattered, or they just like can't be bothered, or sometimes they're kind of feel uncomfortable having to try and communicate in English or whatever other language you speak if it's not Japanese. So I think like having that intro is really powerful. And I know that like a couple of places that we've been to, certainly Jazz Street 52 is the one that always always comes back to me, where I can still remember very, very clearly, like just that moment that like we mentioned the name of the owner of Basie, Sugawara-san, and this guy, it was like someone flicked a switch at the back of this guy's head, like his whole countenance just completely changed, right? And he was suddenly just like beaming. He's like, oh, Sugawara-san?
No, that was Nakadaira-san from Shinjuku Doug. Because remember it was 52.
No, it was 52.
Yeah, 52, the owner, but he had a picture on the counter of him with Nakadaira-san, remember? And we noticed it, and then when we said that we knew him and had interviewed him, that's when he opened up to us.
I thought it was Sugawara-san.
No, Sugawara-san is in the photo because remember we figured out that these two guys had hung out in Tokyo during college, but Sugawara-san went way back up north. And the guy from 52nd Street went all the way back to Kyushu.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because the three of them, because we did sort of dub them the three Beatles, didn't we? Because they obviously they'd kind of come together in this like magical moment of the 60s in Shinjuku. They'd been part of this bohemian jazz kisa culture, and then they went and spread the gospel to various areas of Japan, right?
And that's a wonderful, if unintended, segue, because the Shinjuku connection continued in Miyazaki. Man, I mean, it was unbelievable. So I get down there in the afternoon, and it's subtropical there. You come out and it's just like the airport is surrounded by palm trees. So immediately I was in a good mood. Of course, it started raining and it was very windy. But in any case, I bummed around Miyazaki Station, tried to find.
You have the famous rain jacket? Or?
I did not have the raincoat, but my trusty blue bag is still in tip-top shape. I think we're in year 11 now of the famous blue bag. More pictures coming of it because I do know people love it.
I mean, you can find, if anyone's interested, if you go to the Kagoshima episode or you look on our Instagrams, on our pinned highlights, you can see the famous rain jacket that James produced not long after arriving in...
You were so jealous of it. Your jealousy just shone through... with very harsh sarcasm. I could have used the raincoat, man, because the rain kicked in, and I found myself standing under an awning outside of Family Mart, having a beer, looking at Google Map, trying to figure out, okay, where is this first jazz joint, and do I need to go in and buy something and at least get an umbrella or grab a taxi, already kind of regretting my lack of preparation. But it all worked out because I get to the first place. It's called Lifetime. It's pretty much in downtown Miyazaki, but it's not a very big city. It's the capital of the prefecture, but it's only about maybe 200,000 people. And I walk in, and the owner, Kusano-san, looks at me from behind the counter and says, "I've been waiting for you. What took so long?" And so all of that, the exhaustion of flying and the stress of wandering around Miyazaki City in the rain just immediately went away because I knew, all right, this guy is going to be fun. The fact that he would greet me like that. And Philip, you remember, we've had that so many times when a couple of famous times in all of our talks where we've walked in and they've said, "Hey, we've been waiting for you guys." What took you so long
it's a nice feeling, right? Because again, as we've said many times, a lot of these jazz kisa are, customers are thin on the ground, especially during the daytime. So I think any customer sometimes can be a treat, but the further flung regions you go to, probably the less likely you're expecting like a Westerner or a foreigner who speaks Japanese to arrive. So how come he knew you were coming then?
Well, no, I didn't know he would remember because I had having realized that my trip was very, very tight. I had only 2.5 days, basically. I couldn't risk any of the places not being open. So, regular listeners are going to remember, we always try to just show up out of the blue. Yeah. We want to capture the places the way that they are without them sort of, cleaning or being fussy because 2 foreign guys are coming in. I didn't want to risk that. So I did call him about 1.5 weeks before the trip, asking, what times are you open and what's the best time to come to talk to you? And he was nice on the phone, but he was like, "Oh, look, I'm here pretty much all the time except when I'm not here." And I was like, okay, that's one of those great jazz joint answers. Like, you're there when you're there, but you're not there when you're not there. So, all right, I'm just going to show up. I told him I'd be there sometime around 6. And so I get there actually a little bit early at 5:45. But yeah, he's completely waiting for me, sits me down, immediately just says, "Do you speak Japanese?" I'm like, "Yeah, I speak Japanese." And he just goes off and he tells me all about the joint. They've been open for 45 years. He started out just as a kisaten back in those days. Philip, you remember, we've talked about this before, in the 60s and 70s, there were many, many more just straight ahead kisaten, cafes that opened at noon, for example, but might close a little bit early. But somewhere along the line, the opening hours got extended and they went into what they call bar time here in Japan.
Yeah, and interestingly, actually, again, if those of you who follow our social media more closely, you'll have seen that, I had the chance to exhibit some of the prints at the Queen's Film Theatre in Belfast, and part of that exhibition was the showing. It was only one day, but we did a screening of The Ballad of Swifty, which is the Japanese-made documentary about Basie up in Ichinoseki. And I thought what was really interesting in that was Nakadaira-san from Doug that we've mentioned already in Shinjuku. He talked specifically about that, how it wasn't only the ban on talking that we've mentioned a few times that was a thing, but also there was kind of this sense of like no alcohol too, because it sort of attracted a certain kind of customer or behavior. And so some places actually were quite strict about that. It was less to do with, well, we're a coffee shop. It was more a kind of an official like no alcohol rule. But actually, as kind of time moved on, I suppose maybe as like economic pressure changed in the 70s and 80s, where they had to adapt or disappear, some of these places, like you say, extended their hours, started to offer like food even, and certainly like alcohol. And I'd say most of the places, Japan has pretty lax licensing laws, but most of the places we've been to, even cafes and things like that, if you were able to get a pint of Guinness at 11 a.m., you'd probably be taking it, right?
Yeah, that's for sure.
It's possible, right?
Yeah. What you said is exactly right, because that's exactly what Kusano-san at Lifetime did. He was operating it as a kisaten, but eventually, he started to have some live gigs there on the weekend. And, being very outside of Tokyo, even though Miyazaki is a city, it's much more spread out. So the place is a good 2 to 3 times bigger than your average Japanese jazz kisa,
Nice.
So there's space that he could make a little live corner in there. And at nighttime, so he would split the hours basically between, cafe time, then take a little break and open at night. And he's been running that now for, pretty much 45 years consecutively. But again, like so many of these guys, two things came out immediately. I grabbed my notebook to write this down because we've heard it again and again, but I wanted to get his particular version of it. The first was that he had Shinjuku experience. He worked in Tokyo as a salaryman when he was in his 20s, and he used to hang out at the jazz bars and jazz kiseten of Shinjuku. So he knew some of the names that I had mentioned, and he was throwing out names of a lot of the older joints that, of course, I never got to go to, but I've heard about through, the kinds of things that we would see on matchbooks, when we've seen all the matchbook collections. So he was throwing some of those names out. And he was telling me, he said, listen, you have to realize that, back in those days, in the 60s and 70s, so many of us were sent to college in the Tokyo metro area. And those of us who like jazz would basically go to Shinjuku, sometimes to Shibuya, but it was really Shinjuku. And then we would go back to our hometowns. And that's why you would find a lot of cafes and bars would have the same names as the places that were in Tokyo. And I was like, oh, that's just brilliant. I mean, we've often wondered about that. Why do you have like 3 different versions or 4 different versions with the same name, of a jazz spot?
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's a real classic example of just like that pollination of music, I think, as well. And also, I suppose you have to remember that, if you were going to Shinjuku in the early 60s, that was just 15 years after the end of the war, really. And, communications obviously were not what we know now. So, you could have had a place in Miyazaki for 40 years with the same name as somewhere that, you maybe didn't even know existed, right? It just wasn't that same,
for sure,
networking.
Think about even just before the bullet train, before the Shinkansen, just to go to the Kansai, just to Tokyo to Osaka was an overnight train trip. On a really slow track, So, I mean, it wasn't that easy to get around and people didn't have as much money. So, yeah, you could completely be unaware that somebody had just taken the same name. And, it probably they wouldn't mind anyway. You're just naming it after your jazz heroes. I mean, how many Miles bars or monks or birds are there in Japan, And we'll get to another example of that a little bit later. But yeah, so the Kusano-san said that about Shinjuku. And the second thing, and we discovered this with people in the north of Japan. We discovered it with our good friend at Mokuba in Gunma. Kusano-san helped to promote and bring over jazz musicians from the United States for decades to come play in Miyazaki. Because I noticed right away, Philip, as a photographer, you would have been absolutely bugging when you saw some of the pictures that he had in his bar, particularly a gigantic one, which you can see on my Instagram page. It's a little bit blurry, unfortunately, but it's a gorgeous picture of Sony Rollins playing on the beach in Miyazaki. And Sony Rollins came over to play Miyazaki several times. I think Kusano said 5 different times he came over because he loved Japan and he loved Kyushu and the coastline of Miyazaki so much. And so at one of these gigs, they were going to have a gig on the beach. And they did the sound check and they took some incredible pictures, which is the one that he has above his bar. And all of a sudden, the authorities came and said that they had to cancel the show because there was a tsunami warning. A typhoon was coming to kick in, and it would be dangerous. So all they got to do was record the sound check.
So Sony Rollins literally blew up a storm. But that's interesting, isn't it? Though, because Kyushu is where we came across this samurai poster, right? Where this famous poster of Sony Rollins,
exactly, which you've seen over and over again. Yeah,
yeah. So he obviously had a specific connection. And it's funny because I think, isn't the documentary, there's where he, for a long time, I think for like a couple of years, he used to just play on the bridge, right? And that bridge.
Yeah, he used to play on the Williamsburg Bridge in New York.
Yeah, so it's interesting how he sort of developed, obviously, that connection with that very specific place in Japan as well.
Well, the Kusama-san was saying to me, because I said, listen, I've never heard anyone really talk about Sony Rollins in a bad way, the way you hear sometimes about other musicians, people who worked in the industry or people who were musicians who played with them. And Kusano-san, who is generally a very jovial, laughing kind of guy over our almost 90-minute chat, he just looked at me very seriously and he said, Sony Rollins is the nicest musician I've ever met and one of the nicest people. He was so warm and polite, not just to members of the band, but even to the person bringing his tea at the hotel. He was just a really kind spirit. And so he felt that Sony appreciated the love that he got in Japan and wanted to bring it back. Philip, I was almost in tears hearing this story. I just imagining Sonny just sitting there drinking his tea, being a gentleman, and he's surrounded by 50 to 75 adoring jazz fans, And
I think that's something we forget too, though, isn't it? Like, I mean, I know we have referenced it, but it's only really occurred to me just as you're saying it there, that like in some of the places we've been, obviously, there are literal signatures on walls and on doors from very famous Japanese musicians. But I suppose what's harder to imagine, except in kind of like a fictional way, but in many cases, you're sitting in spaces and listening to sometimes music from musicians who've literally sat there themselves on tour in Japan, whether it's like for a coffee, whether it's like at a jam session after a gig, because we know that happened a lot in like the Kisa and the bar after they played like a concert hall, they would go to the local place and play, or, came for a drink. And it just like, it really underlines that that connection with the culture and that connection with the music that goes beyond just, these physical spaces themselves. It's amazing.
Just truly, truly remarkable. I mean, talking with him for all that time, and he was one of those guys. Oh, it was great. He poured me a beer, and after about 10 minutes, got up, went behind the bar, and he's like, the conversation's already good. I need to drink with you as well. And I was like, oh, this is going to be great. so we dove into a couple of beers together, and he told me more about promoting some of the local, just local things about the city and the culture down there, and what he does currently. They've got a New Year's Eve sort of all night session that's a tradition, where basically all the same customers for years have come back. And, pretty much he was saying that, the jazz scene, like we've seen over and over again, it's just not like it used to be. There's no really viable way economically for them to bring over a musician the stature of Sony Rollins anymore, because there's just not enough fans. However, he said there is some hope because, he does have younger customers. In fact, he says he has a group of 20-somethings who come in once a week every, Wednesday or Thursday. And he's trying to convince them to bring more of their friends and teach them about jazz. But all in all, just a great place, lifetime, one of those kind of spots, again, only that you're going to find in Japan. I mean, we're talking about a city, a regional small city, way down south, and this guy is talking to me about bringing over one of the world's most famous jazzmen, just a remarkable start to the trip. So after I left there, and Philip, you may recall that I'm slightly not the strongest drinker anymore these days.
I mean, I'm going to say, as soon as you said 90 minutes, it was an alarm bell for me, because I'm thinking, if he's in there drinking for 90 minutes to this guy, and it's like you've just arrived there in a subtropical climate, in that rain jacket, which obviously, probably induces a lot of sweat. I would say it's not very breathable. I mean, what state were you in by the time? So this was the evening, right? And what was your plan to go to? How many more places that night?
There was only one more place, but you see, the problem was that I decided not to stay in Miyazaki City. I decided to book a hotel on the coast, 30 minutes south of there. Okay, in a place called Aoshima, which is sort of like a surfing, and there's like a really old shrine on a tiny island right off the coast. Just a kind of a popular spot down there. It's off peak, so I was able to get a good deal on a hotel right on the ocean. So, but stupidly not remembering, I'm not in the Tokyo metro area anymore, and trains are very infrequent. So there's one train an hour, and at night, if you miss the 9 o'clock train, the next one is the last one at about 11:15.
This is where being your carer comes in. I think I race off to the next joint. And of course, I can't find it. Of course, it's raining. I'm already a little bit tipsy. Long story, I find it. It's called Far Cry, named after the Dolphy album. Nice.
And I get in there, and I walk in, and the guy's sitting behind the counter reading a newspaper. And he looks at me and smiles, and he says, "I thought you were coming later."
Oh my God.
I was like, by this point, I can't remember, did I actually talk to this guy? Because I've been calling places and checking times and all that. I was like, oh, I did talk to this guy. That's right. Mr. Koseki. Koseki-san runs Far Cry. It's just a bar. It's a sort of a square, well, a little bit of rectangular bar with just gorgeous decor in it, though.
Right. How old is it? It's an old place, or?
No, not so old. He opened in 1993.
Okay, so fairly recent. It sounds a little bit like that. is it Prestige in Kyoto? That's what I'm imagining, like a bit more modern,
more cluttered though. No. It's quite cluttered, but it's clean. It's clean and sleek. And he's got a ton of whiskey. He's got a lot of like whiskey sort of like, stickers and things on the wall in addition to little knickknacks and stuff. But it's very, very sleek. It's wooden. It's absolutely. I mean, it's a late night jazz bar. You just go in there for a couple drinks, on your way home. It's that kind of quiet. It's a little bit darker. He doesn't pump up the music very loud as far as I can tell. But another guy who has a Shinjuku connection, because when we started talking about Tokyo, he was like, oh, I used to live right next to the old Pit Inn. I'm good friends with Kaibutsu-san. Do you know Kaibutsu-san? He's the guy who used to own the Samurai. I just started laughing.
What?
I was like, yeah, I'm familiar with the Samurai, and I'm familiar with Kaibutsu-san. For our non-Japanese speaking listeners, Kaibutsu means monster in Japanese, and this guy, Kaibutsu-san, is the guy who used to own the Samurai, which I believe was episode 4 of our podcast, which is a whole other long story, but if you're interested in that, Samurai is a place that I was a regular at. Philip, you've been there now 3, 4, 5 times at least.
Yeah, and it's probably one of the most listened episodes, actually, so if you are interested, Samurai's we'll not get into it, but become a slightly more complex place, perhaps, is the best way to put it, but dig back into the podcast. You can get the podcasts on any podcast platform. You can go to SoundCloud, get them directly, and they're all linked to tokyojazzjoints.com as well, so you go in there, you can find whatever episode you're looking for. So yeah, if you're interested in Samurai and Shinjuku in general, actually there's 2 or 3 episodes all recorded around that time. So
Koseki-san at Far Cry, he talked to me about Shinjuku for about half an hour, because it's interesting enough, he's not from Kyushu, he's not from Miyazaki, he's from way up in Yamagata, in Tohoku, in the north part of Japan. So that was curious to me. I was like, we know a lot of people leave their hometowns to go to the big cities. They don't generally go to another tiny regional city in the middle of nowhere. He was a very smiley and nice guy, a little bit of a unique, quirky kind of guy. He also wouldn't let me photograph him because he said he'd recently gotten out of the hospital. And Philip, you've had that experience several times with the older gentlemen or ladies who run the jazz joints, that they can be a little, shy about being on camera when they're not in the best of health, But he actually did not look ill at all. He looked pretty spry. He talked a mile a minute. And he was another one to add to our analog club. Do you remember what the analog club was, Philip? It's been too long since we've done an episode.
Analog club.
Who are the members of the analog club? The owners we've met who not only don't have email or a website, but they don't even have a cell phone. Not even a flip phone.
Oh, nice. Okay, yeah. So there's just like literally you just hang around doorways hoping to meet them.
That's exactly it. So I said to myself, how can I get in touch with you? Because I only found your bar number. Like, do you have an email? Can I get you on social media? He's like, no. I'm only analog. So nice. So he was a really nice guy, and we had a really long chat about, and we've talked about this on some of our lengthier episodes where we get into the sort of aesthetics or the sort of philosophy of the jazz kiseten and the jazz bars. But he knew exactly what I was getting at, because he said right away that this is my living room. I live here. I don't entertain at my home. When people want to see me, they come here, and what they're having to drink or what they're listening to or the books that I'm reading, that's what they see in here. So they have entered my home, and I was just like, wow, this guy's a superstar. I mean, again, sometimes we have to drag the conversation out of these guys, but right away I was 2 for 2, because Koseki-san was just completely open with me, other than not wanting to get his picture taken. I mean, I couldn't have had a better welcome,
I wonder sometimes though if that's the urban thing, like thinking through that, we probably, I'd say there's probably a correlation, isn't there, with like the further places we've been. I think it's the more unusual us turning up can be, and perhaps that just automatically seems to sort of elicit more conversation. Whereas I suppose like Tokyo and Osaka, certainly Tokyo, it is a more standoffish place, and there is that kind of like quieter, cooler vibe, and you maybe do have to work harder. But I think like a lot of the more regional places we've been, it's generally been, I mean, I can remember, a lot of the places like really sitting, like Hokkaido and Kyushu in particular, just really sitting like chatting to people like while we were there, right?
Oh,
rather
for sure.
than talking to each other,
Especially that they're always amazed, like, oh, you here on business or on vacation, and you just popped in. And it's like, no, actually, we came specifically to see you, and the reaction is always just one of astonishment, So, I mean, this guy was completely, he was like, so you really go around and visit all these places around the country? He's like, yeah, that's what I do. And I was so happy I could reach you because, again, it was really difficult. I'd heard of your joint. There was no information online. I saw one picture of it, and you never answered your phone until just 2 days ago. So I didn't think I was actually going to get here. And then he was like, oh, well, it was COVID. Then I was sick in the hospital. But sometimes I don't answer my phone anyway. And so it was actually really lucky that I was able to get to him because, as I mentioned, I had about 45 minutes to sit in Far Cry. So I knocked back a Guinness, ran through the rain to get back to the station.
So dramatic and romantic.
Oh, it was dramatic.
Rain jacket flapping behind you, bags swinging, knocking out pedestrians.
I had to. I remember I checked in my bag at the station, so I had to go get my big duffel bag. Hopped on the train, and I'm like, okay, you know what? 30 minutes, no problem. I can do that piece of cake down to Aoshima. Not realizing that the train, it wasn't exactly the Yamanote line. It was a 1-car train.
Nice.
On a track that I would estimate was built in about 1880, and maybe the train car was built around that time too. So it was shaking. I mean, I've never been on a train that like shook so much for half an hour. And Philip, let's just leave it at, I think you can imagine my physical discomfort at that point.
Yeah, I mean, the one word that's springing to my mind is toilet. So I think, if you've listened to any other episodes, you'll realize probably, yeah. And maybe we'll just leave it there. So you got to Aoshima and then obviously checked in, and that was you. So that's Friday night done, right? So we're moving into Saturday.
That's Thursday night. Yeah,
Thursday night, right? So we're moving into Friday, and obviously then we've got 4 places left. So how did Friday pan out then?
Well, Friday was great. I mean, in the morning, I bummed around the seaside and, went out to the little island in Aoshima. Some really great stuff out there, including some allegedly 20 million year old rocks that have a really strange formation that are supposedly some sort of, healing powers to them. Anyway, a very cool spot down by the ocean. So just killing time before my train. So I get back the train from Aoshima. I have to go back through Miyazaki City and another 20 minutes north up the coast. So now we're really, really deep into Kyushu. And it's called Takanabe City. And believe me, city should be in quadruple quotation marks because this is not a city, okay? I mean, there is literally no... I got out of the train station.
They're quite liberal with the city thing in Japan, aren't they? Like, I mean, because they don't really use the town's not really used in that same way, right? So, like, city is definitely I guess it's one of those ones, if you get a certain thing, like here, if you get like a cathedral, you become a city, but like you could be a tiny place with a cathedral and it's like, it's not a city.
I think here it was more of it was a pork belly politics thing. If you get designated a city, you get a certain amount of funding. But
I think it's pork barrel, not pork belly. But that just maybe you're hungry.
Oh no, I think that's the Sam Smith kicking in. Are you sure it's not pork belly?
I'm pretty sure it's pork barrel.
Politics. Pork barrel.
I mean, I love a pork belly as much as the next person, but I think it has no place in politics.
Let me know. That doesn't even make any sense. Well, anyway, I get into a cab. Lovely old guy. And this was the first guy I met, actually. So I was, I'd already had like an afternoon and evening. This was the first guy I met with a heavy accent. And so he was a little hard to understand. And he was also extremely excited that I was in his cab because he was like, oh, I haven't, during COVID, I haven't had any foreign, customers at all. And I was just thinking like, man, how many foreign customers you have anyway? Like,
and also, most foreigners had to stay in Japan, didn't they? They weren't able to leave, or they couldn't get back in. So you think if any time he was going to have them, it would be when you couldn't fly off to other places. Like,
well, I asked him about like what the local area was. He said, oh, this town really only exists because there's a big Canon factory, Canon, the photography, the photo company, and so he was like, yeah, they've got about like 6,000 workers there. And so them and the Air Force Base are pretty much, everybody in the town is related to those two jobs. But, otherwise it's pretty sleepy. And I was like, I can tell, So I get him, we drive about, maybe more 10, 12 minutes. And we pull up and it's a house and it's just got the most gorgeous frontway. This is like a sort of a neat, tidy, American-looking house, which makes a lot of sense after I met the owner. And it's called Downbeat, yet another Downbeat, which I believe is the fourth,
That's the third, isn't it? Yeah.
Downbeat. And I walk in, and Downbeat is very much a cafe. He's not open at nighttime. And I sit down, and again, he's waiting for me because I had called this guy at least 2 or 3 times to be like, listen, I don't know how I can get to Miyazaki with, and the trains and all this. I don't know what time I'm going to arrive. Can I just show up at like 4:30? He's like, of course, it's fine. I'll wait for you. It's not a problem. So I get to, I walk into Downbeat. It's only about 20 seats, but it's very much in that old Kisa style. It reminded me a little bit of, do you remember in Hokkaido, the first place on our very long trip that we went to called Soen, which was a sort of an addendum to a house? It was a bit like that.
Right.
A little bit dark, but cozy. And, I come in, and the owner, and again, amazingly, the owner there, he's not from that area. He's from Niigata, which is even farther north. So two guys I've met down in Miyazaki who are not even from the area, incredibly. Maybe that makes sense. That's why that they opened the jazz bars. But it all became clear because he said, yeah, he used to be in the Japanese Air Force. So he was sent down there, and he was on the Air Force base, and he got married. And, once he came back to Japan because he lived in the United States, he opened his little jazz joint called Downbeat. And so when he learned I was from America, he got really excited, and he started to speak to me in a mixture of Japanese and English. Now, I wanted to get really into the jazz and all the music he had there, but he wanted to talk about America so much that I had to I had to gaman, as they say in Japan. I just had to put up with it. So we talked about the greatness and the beauty of America for about 30 minutes. He was talking about the Grand Canyon and about the Mississippi River and about all the amazing agricultural innovations in the United States and how great the engineering was and how great the music was. And I was like, well, yeah, okay, I guess you're right. But, we've met maybe not so many in the jazz trip that we've done, Philip, but I think you know exactly the type of person we're talking about. Someone who left Japan and sort of embraced life overseas in a really positive manner, kind of like the way that we did coming to Japan, where we would rave about it, like to people who were visiting. That's what he was going back. And I could tell very much that even though he ran this small cafe, which was absolutely lovely, there was nothing he wanted to do than to go back to the States again. But now that he was retired, his visa ran out, and, he's got grandkids and whatever. And so he was saying that, hopefully COVID would end soon and he could go back because his dream was to go to the New Orleans Jazz Festival. He never got to go there when he was living in the States. So we did bring it back to the jazz eventually. But a very unique guy, and definitely the first jazz owner I've ever met that used to be a part of the Japanese military. That was unexpected. Although we did,
the owner of Step was in the parachute regiment. Wasn't he a paratrooper or something?
Oh, Stick. You mean Jazz Room Stick in Shinjuku?
Yeah, sorry, not Step. Stick.
Yes, you're
Which,
right.
Which, of course, is now gone,
Yeah, what I saw was a paratrooper and a deep sea fisherman, right?
I mean, I'm still in shock at the idea of you talking about the greatness and beauty of America. I mean, to anybody who knows you and the fact that you haven't lived there for 25 years. But anyway, I mean, but it does raise that kind of, it is interesting, isn't it? And we don't need to probably go into it in too much detail, but there is this kind of complicated relationship that I think Japan has with America, and there's so much American influence. I mean, of course, the whole influence of jazz and this whole jazz kissa culture that we're so interested in is comes from largely from America, and it's interesting to find people like that that have that kind of pre-internet fascination and sort of, there's a kind of a love-hate tussle with America. I mean, clearly his sounded just much more like he loved it, but it is an interesting dynamic.
I mean,
isn't
he was just rhapsodizing about driving his car from, I think he said, from Kansas City to Los Angeles, and him and his wife just marveling at the size of the United States. Just the size, not even like it was beautiful or whatever. He was just like, how could this country go on and on and on and on? And again, many of our listeners have never been to Japan. Japan is a long country, but it's very mountainous. It's very, I would describe it as narrow. Japan always feels very narrow to me. You never get those big, wide open vistas that you would get in a country like the U.S. It just doesn't exist here. So you can understand his feeling. You know, he's there driving in the Southwest. Like, of course, he's going to be blown away by it. But you know, it was really fun. I mean, he was a sweet guy. And then, you know, I asked him a little bit more about opening Downbeat, and he'd said that, well, you know, like a lot of people, it was always his dream to, you know, own a restaurant or a cafe after he retired. So this particular place has been open since 1981, but he took it over. That was a little unclear when exactly. He said he took it over while he was still in the Air Force, and then his wife was running it. And now that he's retired, he's running it.
Which is unusual, an unusual reversal of what we've often seen, which is a man, you know, either getting too ill or passing away, and then his wife often taking it over, right?
Oh, which has happened, I mean, at least 24 times for sure, you know, especially given that usually the men were a good 10 to 12 years older. But he told me the two other things that just knocked me out about Downbeat was, one, he knows very well my good buddy Yoshihisa-san at Downbeat in Yokohama. I said, well, how do you know that? Do you go to Yokohama often? He's like, well, my daughter lives in just a couple stations from there. So whenever I visit, I go hang out at Downbeat. And the two Downbeat owners sit and drink together. And I said, amazing. Well, you know, that's my regular. So next time you're up here, you call me and we'll meet up at the Yokohama Downbeat. And the second thing was just completely out of the blue. I said to him, like, so, you know, how did you get to gigs? Like, did you have to go to Miyazaki City, like to Lifetime, the first bar that we talked about? And he was like, well, no, you know, back in those days, like in the late 80s, you know, early 80s, 70s, we had people come play in Takanabe. I saw Art Pepper here and I saw Mal Waldron. And I mean, my jaw just hit the floor. I was like, you saw Art Pepper play in Takanabe City? Like, are you kidding me? You know? So, you know, again, I mean, we're talking not even just Miyazaki Prefecture. We're talking about the real booty end of Miyazaki Prefecture in Takanabe. And, Mal Waldron made more sense because we've seen Mal Waldron pictures all around Japan.
Yeah.
You know,
but it's just astonishing when you think about it. Because, I mean, you know, most people who tour, even now, like it's major cities. And, you know, I mean, it's hard. But if you go and have a look for Takanabe on a map and then, you know, take whatever country you're from and try and find an equivalent place and think of like jazz legends or like, you know, huge bands at the moment coming to play there. Like, you know, other than it being some obscure festival, it's just hard to imagine why it would ever take place. And I think that's one of the really fascinating things about when those floodgates opened in the early 60s for traveling, for touring musicians after Art Blakey's tour, is that like just, it's not even how many people came, it's where they went to. You know, it's just the most obscure places that you would just never, and again, like at a time that we said that where it wasn't easy to get to places, you know?
No, like not at all. And it also wasn't necessarily that affordable for a lot of the local people when salaries were, you know, until the mid 80s when the bubble happened in Japan, you know, people didn't have as much disposable income. So going to a gig for, say, 10 to 15 US dollars at the time would have been a bit of a push for some people. So it's just unbelievable. I mean, when he said that, there was two other things I forgot. So his wife, very kindly, she makes the coffee. She gives me a plate with cake, and I look at it and I'm like, wow, these are really beautiful. And then I notice under the cake, it says Downbeat on the plate. And then another one part, it says jazz. And then the coffee mug was just this beautiful sort of clay mug. And he's like, oh, yeah, I made all of these. I'm like, you made all of these? What? And he's like, yeah, that's one of my hobbies. I make pottery, you know?
Don't tell me you got one.
I did not get one.
He's maybe heard about you trying to buy one off the poor old man in Coltrane. I would say that story's already spread. It's like, watch out for the guy who tries to buy your crockery.
Yeah. I was going to try to offer one, and then I thought, no, if he wanted to give me one, he would give me one, you know? But a really unique guy, because I said to him, I was like, wow, you've got a lot of different hobbies. He's like, no, not really. It's just, you know, I run the jazz bar and I make pottery and I play saxophone in an oldies band. I'm like, wait, what? So he's like, yeah, I play saxophone in an oldies band. You know, me and some of the guys my age, we really love the Southern All-Stars, and we play a lot of other like American oldies as well.
Amazing.
And I was like, well, why don't you play any jazz? He's like, are you kidding? do you know how hard it is to play jazz saxophone? It's like, oh yeah, you're right. So Downbeat was, very hard to get to, but an absolute, a real treat. And I know that I'll see that guy again, even if I don't get to Miyazaki. I'll see him here in Yokohama because he comes to visit his daughter. So just a wonderful place. But that's all. As great as those 3 joints were, those were all just a build up to absolutely one of my top 10 spots in Japan.
Well, at that point, James, I think that's maybe a good place where we're going to leave it for today, because we've got 6 Kyushu joints. We're halfway there, and there's no better cliffhanger than to say that the 3 that you've just explained, so we had Lifetime, we had Far Cry, and then we had Downbeat. If there's 3 better ones coming, well, I think that's probably going to justify another episode. So we're going to put a pin in it there. We're going to see you all for the next episode. Thank you for listening today. We appreciate your support as always. It's good to be back in front of this microphone. We hope you enjoy it. What's been really fascinating for me is over the last year, just to see those numbers ticking up slowly on SoundCloud. And I think sometimes we almost forget that is out there. The podcast is out there, and there's still people discovering it for the first time. And I've had a couple of really nice emails, people saying, oh, I've been in hospital, I've been home recuperating, I can't go out. I discovered the podcast, I've been listening to these stories and looking at the photos and enjoying the project's really brought it to life. And it's so gratifying for us. Like, we do this project out of love. We do it because it's something that we enjoy. But the ability to be able to share it with people and to get that feedback is really fantastic. We're up to about 80,000 listens now on SoundCloud, which is way beyond our furthest dreams when we first started the podcast. And thank you to all of you for listening. Please keep following the project, tokyojazzjoints.com. There's always little bits and things coming up on the news section where we're featured somewhere. Maybe an article's been published or there's a plan for an exhibition. Keep an eye on our socials, particularly on Instagram at Tokyo Jazz Joints. And thank you for listening. And we'll see you again for part 2 of 6 Kyushu joints. Thought you were going to speak there, James.
I was about to, and then I kind of lost it. Yeah, I thought you had something else coming when you slowed down.
No. Anyway,
catch you all soon, man. It's so great to talk jazz again. I'm thrilled.
You too. Take it easy,
Ciao.
man. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye.